Good day, dear students. Today we are going to start with lecture number 29 of social linguistics. Now, because we're coming to the end of the topic, very close now, I want to clear one thing, that psycholinguistics and social linguistics, they in themselves are a very, very vast field. So we can't say that if in just one course, when we combine both of them, that we can study all the aspects of both of psycholinguistics and social linguistics. So we tried to cover a lot of psycholinguistics in our previous lectures, and in social linguistics now we are trying to cover as many phases as we can. But once again, like I said, it's a very vast study, so maybe we won't be able to complete all the different aspects of it. So don't think that the only things that we are studying, that it all this is all, that's all it consists of. So there are many other aspects also that you can further investigate, and in your further education you will come across. So when we come back now to the main point in social linguistics, we were talking about in an article on the varieties of speech, he found among the 1700 or so speakers of Menominee an Amerindian language of Wisconsin Bloomfield in 1927 mentioned a variety of skills that were displayed among some of the speakers he knew best. So we were talking about the researcher previously. So a woman in her 60s who spoke a beautiful and highly idiomatic Menominee, her husband who used forms which are current among bad speakers, and some occasions an elevated speech. Now, incorporating form best described as spelling pronunciations, ritualistic compound words, and occasional archaisms on others. So when an American Indian language, basically, which is called Amerindian, it was spoken in Wisconsin and Bloomfield in USA. So at that time, in 1927, they discovered that it was a language that was very beautifully and highly skilled. And they wanted to give you an example of the people who spoke that language. So, well, like I said, different languages are spoken in different societies in a different way, and people perceive them in a different way. So they gave an example of a woman in her 60s who spoke a beautiful and highly idiomatic Menominee, and her husband used a very casual form of that same language. So on some occasions that he was considered maybe in the bad speakers, and sometimes in elevated speech. So they maybe had different ways of spelling pronunciations and ritualistic compound words. So an old man who spoke with bad syntax and maigre, often inept vocabulary, yet with occasional archaisms. So we would say that a man that is older of age maybe doesn't know the best syntax or structure of a language. So we were taking an example of him being, if he was speaking in bad syntax, a man about 40 with atrocious Menominee, that is a small vocabulary, barbarous inflections, and threadbare sentences. And two half-breeds, one who spoke using a vast vocabulary. So we're taking examples of different people, and we say that one was a man of about 40 with an atrocious Menominee, that is a small vocabulary and barbarous inflections, threadbare sentences also. And then they took two half-breeds. Half-breeds are people who the mother and father are of different regions or different breeds or different nationalities. So one who spoke using a vast vocabulary, and the other who employed racy idiom. So one which had a very high variety of language, and one, let's say, with a low variety of language. Now, value judgments of this kind sometimes emerge for reasons that are hard to explain. sometimes value judgments of this kind would be difficult because they are hard to explain. For example, there appears to be a subtle bias built into the way people tend to judge dialects. So in a way, they are sort of one-sided. They take one side and tend to lean towards that more when they're trying to judge different dialects. So quite often, and you know what a dialect is. A dialect is, you can have different languages, and then one language can have different dialects. So quite often, though not always, people seem to exhibit a preference for ritual dialects over urban ones. So sometimes people do prefer to speak preference for rural dialects over urban ones. That means that they speak the village type of dialects or the way of pronouncing a word instead of the people that speak in the city. So, and many people prefer to speak in their old version, which is spoken in the villages. So in England, the speech of Northumbria seems more highly valued than the speech of Tennesside, and certainly the speech of Liverpool seems less valued than that of Northwest England as a whole. So in England, most of the speech of Northumbria seems like highly valued, because then they would like make a comparison with the speech of Tennesside and certainly the speech of Liverpool. So there is a difference between the speech quality and the pronunciations and the words of Northumbria than the speech and in Tennesside and Liverpool, and that seems valued than that of the Northwest England as a whole. So they take that as a whole. So in North America now, the speech of upstate New York does not have the negative characteristics associated with much of the speech of New York City. So North America, like if we start considering that, we would say that the upstate New York does not have negative characteristics that the speech of the New York City would have. So in New York City, they might have a different pattern of pronouncing the words, and the speech is a little different from what they would speak upstate New York. So why such different attitudes should exist is not easy to say. Why people take language in a different way, or why they would speak and change maybe the pronunciations, or slur the words, or sort of change the words, that isn't clear, because different people, when they live in a society, then they tend to start speaking that way. So is it a preference for things that appear to be older and more conservative? So maybe, yes, they want to think about the old times and the way the language was spoken. Then a subconscious dislike of some of the characteristics of urbanization. So you can say that it's maybe a subconscious dislike of the characteristics of urbanization, including like making characteristics of the way people live in the city. So including uncertainty about what standards should prevail, or some other reasons or reasons for it. So sometimes these notions of better and worse solidify into those of correctness and incorrectness. So when we start considering that, now concerning the later notions, the popular explanation of correct and incorrect speech reduces the matter to one of knowledge versus ignorance. So when we are saying that if we look at the different notions of it, then the popular explanation would be the correct and the incorrect ways of speech. And that would reduce the matter that we would think that the people who have knowledge would use the speech in a correct way, and the people who are ignorant would use the speech in an incorrect way. Now, there is such a thing as correct English. So an ignorant person does not know the correct forms, so therefore he cannot help using incorrect ones. So in that they say that yes, English does have a correct form, and only the knowledgeable people who know the language can speak it correctly, and somebody who is ignorant, he will not know the form, so he can't use them, and he would use the incorrect one and not speak properly. So in the process of education, one learns the correct forms, and by practice and an effort of will, careful speaking acquires the habit of using them. So in process of education, when a person is getting his education, then one would learn to use the correct forms of the language of, let's say, English, and they would practice that, and then effortlessly, like they wouldn't have an effort in performing the language or processing the language. So an effort of will would be of careful speaking, and that would acquire the habits of using them. So we need to acquire a habit to learn to speak carefully, and that comes from our education. So if one associates with ignorant speakers or relaxes the effort of will, careless speaking, one will lapse into the incorrect forms, and there is one error in the popular view which is of special interest. So if we say that if even an educated person would associate himself with ignorant speakers, and he would like communicate more with ignorant people, and he would like to spend time with them more, then he would sort of relax his effort of will to speak carefully, and he would become more careless in his speaking, and he would then fall into the incorrect forms of language and start using those, and so that would result to having his language get ruined, and it would be the incorrect form of language. So there is another error in the popular view which is of special interest, and that is the incorrect forms cannot be the result of ignorance or carelessness, for they are by no means haphazard, but on the contrary very stable. So the incorrect forms of language, we can't say that they're the cause or the result of ignorance or people who don't know anything, or if they're careless. Because it is by no means haphazard, that means that it's not a distorted or spread out sort of view, but people use them in a very stable way. That when they want to use the incorrect form of language, they will use it in a very correct and formal way, so that would be the low variety of the language. Now, for instance, if a person is so ignorant as not to know how to say, "I see it in past time," we might expect him to use all kinds of chance forms, and especially to resort to easily formed locutions. So such as "I did see it," or to the addition of the regular past suffix "I seed it." So when they would say that they would use the incorrect form, so an ignorant person, he wouldn't know how to say this, that "I see it in past time," like meaning that I've already seen it. So we might expect him to use a different form, let's say, like, for example, "I did see it," or that "I seed it." Now that is incorrect. So, but instead these ignorant people quite consistently say "I seen it." So instead of saying that "I seed it" or "I did see it," they would say "I seen it," which also is incorrect. But when you see that it's not done out of carelessness, it's on purpose. They have just learned that way to speak, and that's how they will continue in it. Now, but instead, these ignorant people quite consistently say "I seen it," and now it is evident that one fixed and consistent form will be no more difficult than the other. So a person who has learned "I seen" as the past of "I see" has learned just as much as one who says "I saw." So the learning amount is the same, but the way or the thing that they are learning, that is incorrect. So they're giving the same amount of effort to learn the language, but not in a correct way. So he has simply learned something different. Now, although most of the people who say "I seen" are ignorant, their ignorance does not account for this form of speech. So it's not just because they're ignorant that they that's why they use these forms. It is because they are taught in that way. So in a way we would say that a person is not ignorant just by the way he speaks, but is ignorant because of the way he is taught and the way he learns a language. So the people, the way he's learned it, that is the incorrect way, which puts him into the category of being an ignorant. So many people hold strong beliefs on various issues having to do with language and are quite willing to offer their judgments on issues like, you can see Boyer and Trudgill in 98, and Niedzelsky and Preston in 1999, and Wardhowe in 99. So they believe such things as certain languages lack grammar, so that you can speak English without an accent, that French is more logical than English, that parents teach their children to speak, and the primitive languages exist, and so on and so forth. So according to these people, they believe that there are strong beliefs and on various issues that they can say that these languages that are created, or dialects, they would lack the use of grammar. And then you can maybe say that you can speak English without an accent, so your English would be pure, or that French is more logical than English, it's more logical to speak French language instead of English, or that parents teach their children to speak, or that only parents are involved in the learning of a child, and that primitive languages exist. There are languages that are not urbanized, not the way people speak in the city, that English is degenerating, and language standards are slipping, and that English is losing its grip on the language standards, and slowly it's disintegrating or getting less day by day, and the language standards are slipping, they're disappearing, so that pronunciation should be based on spelling, and so on and so on. So much discussion of language matters in the media concern such issues, and there are periodic attempts to clean up various bits and pieces. So attempts that Cameron in 1995 calls verbal hygiene. So so many discussions say that language matters in the media would concern such issues, and there are periodic attempts to clean up the various bits and pieces. So attempts that Cameron in 1995 would call verbal hygiene. So most linguists studiously avoid getting involved in such issues, having witnessed the failure of various attempts to influence received opinions on such matters. So as I have written elsewhere in 1999, linguists know that many popular beliefs about language are false, and that much we are taught about language is misdirected. So according to our research, we would say that linguists have a popular belief that languages, the beliefs about languages that are false, and that we are taught about language and we are misdirected. So they also know how difficult it is to affect change. So how to create change, how difficult that would be to change a language. So language beliefs are well entrenched, as are language attitudes and language behaviors. So sociolinguists should strive for an understanding of all three, because all affect how people behave towards others. So sociolinguistics, according to them, they would say that language beliefs are entrenched, as are language attitudes. So language attitudes and language behaviors are the same as language beliefs, and they're all intertwined with each other. So sociolinguistics should, they think that it should strive for an understanding of all of the three things: the language belief, the language behaviors, and the language attitudes, because all would affect how a person would behave toward the language, or how he would adopt a language. So as we have seen now, many varieties of language exist, and each language exists in a number of guises. So There are so many varieties of languages now all over the world that people speak, and many are spoken in different guises. That means that there are so many ways of speaking, let's say even English, like I've told you before, like American English, British English, Australian English. So all of these would have an Indian or Pakistani English. So there is a difference in the way we pronounce and we would use the language. So however, languages do not vary in every possible way. So they're not different in every possible way. It is still quite possible to listen to an individual speaker and infer very specific things about it, that speaker, after hearing relatively little of his or her speech. So sometimes now it's still quite possible that you can listen to a person, you can listen to the way he speaks, or the way he speaks about specific things, and when you hear the person, you can tell about his or her speech. So the interesting problem is accounting for our ability to do that. So how do we account for our ability to distinguish between an individual person and the way he speaks? Now, what are the specific linguistic features we rely on to classify a person as being from a particular place? A member of a certain social class, a representative of a specific profession, a social climber, a person pretending to be someone he or she is not, and so on. So what are the specific linguistic features that we would say that we would use to classify a person as being from a particular place or from a particular society or a member of a certain social class? And how would we judge that a representative of a specific profession would speak in such a way, and a social climber or a person pretending to be someone he or she is not, let's say like an ignorant person trying to act like an educated person? So how do we distinguish them from other people? Now, one possible hypothesis is that we rely on relatively few cues. Now, for example, the presence or absence of certain linguistic features. So how we would do that, one hypothesis, one way that we think that we can solve it would be that maybe we would try to notice the linguistic features used, certainly. And then we are also sensitive to the consistency or inconsistency in the use of those cues. So we're also sensitive to the way that those cues are used. And so that on occasion, it is not just that a particular linguistic feature is always used, but that it is used such and such a % of the time rather than exclusively or not at all. Now, however, we may actually perceive its use or non-use to be categorical. Now that is that the feature to be totally present or totally absent. So this last hypothesis is an interesting one in that it raises very important questions about the linguistic capabilities of human beings. So however we may say that actually we would perceive the use or the non-use of in a categorical way, and that the feature to be totally present or totally absent from a language. So the last hypothesis would be an interesting one, that we would say that it raises very important questions about linguistic capabilities of human beings, particularly about how individuals acquire the ability to use language in such ways. So you must learn to use both linguistic features. For X, for example, ing endings on verbs, and linguistic feature Y, that is, for example, the in endings on verbs, and how to use them in different proportions in situations of A, B, and C, and so on. So what does that tell us about innate human abilities and the human capacity of learning? So when we want to say that we wanted the ability to use language in such a way, and when we want to learn a specific language, we would say that yes, we would love to we need to, or we would love to learn both the ways of the language, and that would be that we want to learn how to put ing and use the word, or let's say in, like singing with an ing, or singin with an in. So, and then how you would use that in different proportions and in different situations. Let's say we've created 3 situations, A, B, and C, and so on. So how we would use those 2 ways of language features. So what does that tell us about the innate human? That means the inbuilt human abilities or the qualities in a person, and the capacity that a human being has for learning a language. Now, the existence of different varieties is interesting in still another respect. While each of us may have productive control over only a very few varieties of a language, we can usually comprehend many more. So, varieties, and relate all of these to the concept of a single language. So, when we say that while each of us may have productive control over only a very few varieties of a language, we can usually comprehend many more varieties and relate all of these to the concept of a single language, and put all of those and relate them to one single way of speaking a language. So that is, our receptive linguistic ability is much greater than our productive linguistic ability. So that would be that the receptive linguistic ability is higher in ability and much greater than how we produce the language, or our productive linguistic ability. So an interesting problem for linguists would be that is knowing how best to characterize this knowledge that we have, which enables us to recognize something as being in the language but yet marked as different in some way. So the interesting problem would be that how do we characterize the knowledge, how do we define it, and how do we say that what enables us to recognize that that the language is being spoken in some different way. So is it part of our competence or part of our performance in the Chomskyan sense? So according to Chomsky's view, do you think is it all dependent on our competence, or is it dependent on the part of our performance? So, or is that a false dichotomy? So the first question is yet unanswered, but as the second suggests, it could possibly be unanswerable. So when we go into a discussion of this, we would say that when might each of the following sentences be stylistically appropriate? When would they be appropriate? Attention-wise, so I do hereby bequeath. How do we use that word? I do hereby bequeath. Our Father, which art in heaven. Been to see your dad recently? So when we say that I do hereby bequeath, that means that you're committing to something, and then our Father which art in heaven, that means they're referring to it's the Christian way of referring to God in heaven. So been to see your dad recently, now that's common language. That's something that we would use in the daily communication. Get lost, that would also be a very, very informal way of speaking. So now if we consider the relationship between social class and income, we would say come off it, take care, haven't we met somewhere before? So in these three, that come off it, that would be very casual. Take care, that would be a little bit more formal, and then haven't we met somewhere before? That would be according to showing the different social classes from low to high. Now, what stylistic characteristics do you associate with each of the following activities? Talking to a young child, writing an essay for a professor, playing a board game with a close friend, approaching a stranger on the street to ask for directions, or attending a funeral. So we would say that what stylistic characteristics would you associate yourself with it? So maybe the way you talk to a child would be different. Writing an essay for a professor would be in a different way. Playing a board game with a close friend. Then approaching a stranger on the street to ask for directions. Attending a funeral. Talking to yourself. getting stopped for speeding, or burning your finger. So these are different situations that you can see that you would associate with how you would use the language with these different situations. Now, how would you use the language with a young child? Then when you were writing an essay for a professor, the formal way of writing the essay would be in very literate way of writing it, by using proper vocabulary and grammar. Then playing a board game with a close friend, you could make sounds like, oh my god, or come off it, or what did you do? That would be casual and common conversation. Then when you're approaching a stranger on the street to ask for directions, you would do it in a very decent and proper way, that can you please direct me to such and such place. Or when you're attending a funeral, then you will be even more formal by expressing your grief that you're so sad about the death of the person, and that giving prayers, saying prayers for that person. And then talking to yourself, you would be in a different way, you would be using the language in a different way. Getting stopped for speeding, that would be in like requesting the police guy and the policeman for letting you go because you were stopped for speeding. Or that if you would burn your finger, you would say ouch or ow, or those expressions of sounds that you would use to express your pain. Now, one of the easiest way of persuading yourself that there are registers associated with different occupations is to read materials associated with different callings. So you can quickly compile register differences from such sources as law reports. So the easiest way of persuading yourself that different registers, there are registers associated with different occupations, so there are different ways of using the language depending on your occupation and how you read the materials associated with the different ways. So you can quickly compile registered differences from such sources as law reports. The way they would use the language in law reports would be different. Hairdressing or fashion magazines have a totally different way of using language. Scholarly journals would be very formally educated. Recipe books have a different pattern. Sewing patterns would instruct in a different way. Instruction manuals, textbooks, and so on. So the supply is almost inexhaustible. So you might compile lists of words from various sources and find out how long it takes one of your fellow students to identify the particular sources as you read the lists aloud. So Hudson in 1996 says, your dialect shows who or what you are, whilst your register shows that what you are doing. So he acknowledges that these concepts are much less distinct than the slogan implies. So the concept of how your dialect would show that who you are or what you are, or what you are doing with the language. So we would say that the distinction of this slogan would imply that however you might use them to sort out what would be dialect. And register for a professor of sociology from Mississippi said that a hairdresser from Newcastle working in London, a British naval commander, a sheep farmer in New Zealand, and a streetwise person from any location you might choose would all have different ways of using the language, and that would come into the categories of dialects. So Wolfram and Fasold in 1974 offer the following working definitions of what they called standard. So superstandard or hypercorrect, and substandard or non-standard speech. So they say of someone that if his reaction to the form, not the content of the utterance, is neutral, and he can devote full attention to the meaning, then the form is standard for him. So if his attention is diverted from the meaning of the utterance because it sounds naughty, then the utterance is superstandard. So if his attention is diverted from the message because the utterance sounds like poor English, then the form is substandard. So these are the different forms you can divide the language into. So we would see a list of sentences now, that, and what I would like to know is that what are your reactions to each of the following. So when you read this list of sentences, students, I would like you to note down in front of it your reaction. Your reaction would be to make a scenario, create a scenario, and say how that scenario, in what scenario this particular sentence would be applied. So, am I not? So I would like you to create a scenario for that and complete it. He ain't got none. May I leave now? Most everyone says that. It is I. It was pretty awful. Lay down, Fido. He wants to know whom we met. Between you and I seen him. Are you absolutely sure? And who did you mention it to? So am I not would be like in a question form when you're asking somebody. So he ain't got none. That would be in the slang word of a dialect from the language. May I leave now? That would be a very polite way when you're speaking in a formal situation. Most everyone says that. So that would be incorrect grammar. It is I. Also incorrect grammar, and an ignorant person would be using that. It was pretty awful. So that would be very formal and high quality of language. Lay down, Fido. That would be speaking to a dog. He wanted to know whom we met. That's when we are referring to the third person. Between you and I. Now once again incorrect grammar. I seen him. Ignorant person using incorrect grammar, wrong word facility. So are you absolutely sure? That would be correct. And who did you mention it to? So try to apply Wolfram and Fasol's definitions. Now what judgments might you be inclined to make about a person who always clearly and carefully articulates every word he or she says in all circumstances? So what would your idea be of that person who would very carefully articulate a word in every circumstance? So a person who insists on saying both between you and I and it's I, what would your concept be about that person? Then a person who uses malapropisms, a person who is speaking rapidly in succession to a number of others, easily shifts from one variety of speech to another. Who would that person be? That person would be a multilingual. So what do you regard as the characteristics of a good speaker of English and of a poor speaker? So consider such matters as pronunciation, word choice, syntactic choice, fluency, and style. So there seems to be evidence that many people judge themselves to speak better than they actually do, or if not better, at least less casually than they do. So do you know of any such evidence? If it is the case that people do behave this way, why might it be so? So find some articles or books on good speaking, on how to improve your speech, or on how to impress others through increasing your vocabulary and so on. So you can try to read articles and books for good speaking, and you can improve your speech, and then in that way you can impress other people by the use of vocabulary, by increasing the use of vocabulary. And then you can see how people will behave to that, and how valuable is the advice you find in such materials. So if you had access to only a single style or a variety of language, what would be your thoughts? And what difficulties do you think you might encounter in trying to express different levels of formality as the social situation changed around you? Or to indicate such things as seriousness, mockery, humor, respect, and disdain. So how would you express these social situations if they changed around you and you had to think about things in a serious way, or mockery by mocking somebody, or humor by creating humor, or in the face of respect, or in disdain or distress? So is the kind of variation you need a resource that more than compensates for the difficulties that result in teaching the language, or arriving at some consensus concerning such concepts as correctness or propriety. So Hudson in 1996 says that lay people sometimes ask linguists questions such as, where is real Cockney spoken? They assume such questions are meaningful. So another is Jamaican Creole a kind of English or not? So Hudson says that such questions are not the kind of questions that can be investigated scientifically. So these questions, like where is real Cockney spoken, or is Jamaican Creole kind of English, or if not, these questions cannot be investigated scientifically. There is no scientific way of investigating them. So having read this chapter, can you think of some other questions about language which are frequently asked about, which might also be similarly unanswerable? So how about following? Who speaks the best English? Where should I go to learn perfect Italian? Why do people write and talk so badly these days? Explain why each is unanswerable by a linguist at least. So according to the 12th point, Cameron in 1996 includes the following practices under verbal hygiene. Prescriptivism, that is the authoritarian promotion of elite varieties as norms of correctness. Campaigns for plain English, spelling reform, dialect, and language preservation. So non-sexist and non-racist language, Esperanto, and the abolition of the copula. So we would say that we would try to learn the elite varieties of the norm of correctness, and how the campaigns for plain English are working, and how you would reform the spelling or the dialect, and how a language is preserved for centuries and centuries. So a non-sexist language that does not differentiate between the male or the female gender, and non-racist that doesn't differentiate, doesn't have a difference in the social classes. So Esperanto would be one of those languages, and the abolition of the copula. So self-improvement activities such as allocution and accent reduction. Then neuro-linguistic programming, assertiveness training, and communication skills training. So how helpful or how harmful do you consider such activities? So Mugglestone writes as follows, that the process of standardization can and will only reach completion in a dead language. So the process of standardization, it can only be done in a dead language, something that is long ago forgotten. So where the inviolable norms, so often asserted by the prescriptive tradition, and the absolutes of language attitudes, may indeed come into being. So how do they come into being? By the absolute attitudes of language. So if variation sets limits to language standardization, why do some people still insist that rigid standards should be prescribed and followed? So when we go into studying about pidgins and creoles now among the many languages of the world are a few often assigned to somewhat marginal position. Now these two, the various lingua francas, which are pidgins and creoles. So there are so many languages in the world that are assigned to somewhat marginal positions and don't have such a high position, and so the lingua francas would be those two, especially pidgins and creoles. So to the best of our knowledge, all have existed since time immemorial. So long ago these languages existed, but in comparison with what we know about many fully fledged languages, we know comparatively little about them. So there is so much about the fully fledged languages, but if we look at them, that we don't know much about those fully fledged languages. So there is a paucity of historical records. The history of serious study of such languages goes back only a few decades. And because of the circumstances of their use, they have often been regarded as being of little intrinsic value or interest. So, until recently, Pidgins and Creoles have generally been viewed as uninteresting linguistic phenomena, and being notable mainly for linguistic features that they have been said to lack. Now, for example, articles, the copula, and grammatical inflections, rather than those they possess, and those who speak them have often been treated with disdain, even contempt. And the reason is because in so many cases, the linguistic phenomena, being notable mainly for linguistic features, have been said to lack in those circumstances. So Himes in 1971, on page 3, has pointed out that before the 1930s, Pidgins and Creoles were largely ignored by linguists, so who regarded them as marginal languages at best. So they didn't even consider them as a complete full language, and they thought that Pidgins and Creoles were just marginal languages and nothing more than that. So some linguists were even advised to keep away from studying them lest they jeopardize their careers. So some of them were even threatened or scared that if they go ahead and try to study the Pidgins and Creoles, and that they would jeopardize their careers, or they would give a bad impression in their careers, because those languages are marginal and they are of no importance. So he points out that Pidgins and Creoles are marginal in the circumstances of their origin. So how they were created, or their origin of that language, that was marginal. And in the attitude towards them on the part of those who speak one of the languages from which they derive. So, and the attitude how people would consider the Creole and Pidgin being a marginal language, and what languages they're derived from, that they're made from, created from. So they're also marginal in terms of knowledge about them, even though these languages are of central importance to our understanding of language, and central too in the lives of some millions of people. So even though that we think that these are marginal languages in terms of knowledge, but these do have an importance in understanding the language, how we understand languages. So it helps us to know through these, and then how that it's a part also of so many millions of people who live all around the world. So because of their origins, however, their association with poorer and darker members of the society, and through perpetuation of misleading stereotypes. So most interest, even where positive, has considered them merely curiosities. So even just because they were the origins of those languages of Pidgin and Creole were from the poorer people in the society, or people who were not well known in society and weren't considered high in social class, it was quite misleading, because the most interest, like they said, was positive, even when it was mere curiosities instead of being just positive interest in that language. So he adds that much interest and information, scholarly as well as public, has been prejudicial. So these languages have been considered not creative adaptations, but degenerations. Not systems in their own right, but deviations from other systems. So according to them, they said that these languages are considered to be creative adaptations, that they've adapted these many things in this language from other languages, and that it is degenerating of a language, and that they don't have their own system in the right, and that deviations from other systems also. So it's like they've taken material from another source to put into these systems and create this language. So their origins have been explained not by historical and social forces, but by inherent ignorance. So indolence and inferiority. So as languages of those without political and social power, literatures and culture, they could be safely and properly ignored. So for what could they possibly tell us about anything that English and French or even Greek, Latin and Sanskrit could not? What do you think that Pidgin and Creole can tell us about a culture or a social power, or that English, French or Greek or Latin or Sanskrit can not tell us? So fortunately, in recent years such attitudes have changed, and serious attention has been given to Pidgins and Creoles. So linguists have discovered many interesting characteristics about them, characteristics that appear to bear on fundamental issues to do with all languages, fully fledged and marginal alike. Now, moreover, Pidgins and Creoles are invaluable to those who use them. So not only are they essential to everyday living, but they are also frequently important markers of identity. So in an interview in 1978, a schoolboy in Belize had this to say about his language. Well, usually in Belize, you find the language. The main language you know is the slang that I tell you about, the Creole. So that schoolboy in the interview who lives in Belize, what he said was he used Creole, the language Creole, and said that it's all slang. That means that it's all slang language. And you'd recognize them by that, you know. They usually have this, you know, very few of them speak the English, or some of them usually speak Spanish. So Lee Page and Turbulate Keller in 1985. So the study of Pidgins and Creoles has become an important part of linguistics, and especially sociolinguistic study, with its own literature and of course its own controversies. So with Pidgins and Creoles we can see processes of language origin and change going around us. So we can also witness how people are attracted to languages, how they exploit what language resources they have, and how they forge new identities. So we do not have to wait a millennium to see how a language changes. A few generations would surface, or to some extent too, the speakers of such languages have benefited as more and more of them have to come to recognize that what they speak is not just a bad variety of this language or that, but a language or variety of a language with its own legitimacy. So that is that its own history, structure, arrays of functions, and the possibility of winning eventual recognition as a proper language. So when we would further go into seeing that what lingua francas are. Now people who speak different languages, who are forced into contact with each other, must find some way of communicating, which would be a lingua franca. So people, when they're forced into contact, when they are forced into such a situation where they have to communicate with each other, and they are from different societies and different countries or different language backgrounds, so they need to create a lingua franca. That means that a language that is common to all. So in a publication concerned with the use of vernacular languages in education, published in Paris in 1953, UNESCO defined a lingua franca as a language which is used habitually by people whose mother tongues are different in order to facilitate communication between them. So lingua franca would be that it was a language that is used by people, and they make a habit of using that language because their mother tongues are different, so their native languages are different, and it facilitates them in communicating with each other. So a variety of other terms can be found which describe much the same phenomena. So we can say that there are a variety of other terms also that would describe the same phenomena. So Samarin lists four to describe these terms. A trade language, where people can use wherever they're going for trade, so it would be easy for them to trade the goods from one country to a different country. So for example, Hausa in West Africa or Swahili in East Africa. a contact language, how people can stay in contact. For example, the Greek koine in the ancient world, how they contacted the people. Then an international language, English throughout much of our contemporary world. So an international language where that means that all over the world that language is spoken. So English would be one of those. And an auxiliary language, which is Esperanto or basic English. So auxiliary language, something that the humans have created now, which also would be considered, or they were trying to make it an international language like Esperanto or the basic English. So they usually develop as a consequence of population migration, forced or voluntary, or for purposes of trade. So what they even they're voluntarily using the language, or they're forced together to use the language. They develop in the population of migration when they're migrating from one place to another, or for purposes of trade in business. So still another kind of lingua franca is a mixed language. Baker in 1997 describes one such language, mischief, a mixture of Cree and French, spoken mainly in Canada by well under 1,000 people of Métis, Aboriginal and French ancestry. So mischief is one language, and it's spoken basically by the Aboriginal or the French people who had French ancestry. That means जिनके अबाउजात French या Aboriginal लोगों में से थे. So ये language जो है ये कनाडा में बोली जाती है, और ये Cree and French language का mixture है. So many people जिनके अबाउजात French थे, वो अब आके बसे हुए हैं कनाडा में, और उनके अंदर ये लैंग्वेज बड़ी इम्पोर्टेंट है. So mischief is sometimes characterized as a language that mixes Korean verbs and French nouns. So इसमें वो Cree verbs को use करते हैं and French के nouns को. But probably more accurately is one that uses Cree grammar and French vocabulary. So it is a clear marker of group identity for those who use it, and emerge to express a new ethnic identity. So mixed Cree and French would be a new language which was needed to express that identity. So the most obvious way to form a new language was through mixing two community languages, Cree and French. So Winford adds that the mischief are an example of the newly emerged social groups who wanted a language of their own, and who saw themselves as distinct from either of the cultural groups from which they descended. So according to Winfred, they said that many of these people were, they thought that they were different or distinct, or in a way separate from, let's say if they descended from the Aboriginal people or from the French community, they had their ancestry there. So they thought that they needed language for to identify their own social group. Now, at one time or another, Greek Koine and Vulgar Latin were in widespread use as lingua francas in the Mediterranean world and much of Europe. So, mostly in Greek Koine and Vulgar Latin, they said that Vulgar Latin, they mean that not the pure, long ago, ancient Latin, but a very common form of Latin. So they were like in the Mediterranean world or in Europe, they were using those as the lingua francas to communicate. Now, Saber was a lingua franca of the Mediterranean and later far beyond. So originating in the Middle Ages and dating back at least to the Crusades. So we would say that Saber was a lingua franca of the Mediterranean and later far beyond. So originating in the Middle Ages, long, long back ago, and dating back at least to the Crusades. That is so far back. It survived into the 20th century. So let's say from the Crusades and surviving into the 20th century, is a huge accomplishment of that language. So in other parts of the world, Arabic, Mandarin, Hindi and Swahili have served as lingua francas and do serve as lingua francas. So of these, Arabic was a lingua franca associated with the spread of Islam. So when Islam was spread, so they said that Arabic was a lingua franca because everybody had to learn to use that special form of Arabic even to read the Quran. So it was considered as a lingua franca then. So today English is used in many places and for many purposes as a lingua franca. So yes, now many people, where if they, like for example, don't know the language, they go to a different country, let's say they've gone to Italy or France or Spain. So if they don't know Spanish or French or Italian, then they would, let's say a person from Pakistan has gone there, so he would use English as a lingua franca to communicate with those people. So, especially in travel and often in trade, commerce and international relations. So a lingua franca can be spoken in a variety of ways. Although both Greek, Aeolian and Vulgar Latin served at different times as lingua francas in the ancient world, neither was a homogeneous entity. So even though you can use it in different ways, that Greek, Koine and Vulgar Latin were served at different times as lingua francas in the ancient world, and they weren't in a homogeneous entity, that they weren't the same. So not only were they spoken differently in different places, but individual speakers varied widely in their ability to use the language. So English serves today as a lingua franca in many parts of the world. So for some speakers it is a native language, for others a second language, and for still others a foreign language. So however, in the last two categories of being a second language or a foreign language, the abilities in the language may vary widely from native-like to knowledge, and for some bear rudiments. So this is certainly the case in India, where even though Hindi is the official language, English spoken in all kinds of ways is widely used as a lingua franca. Swahili in Pakistan, you can also say that just like in India, even though Urdu is the official language, but English is also used as a lingua franca in Pakistan. So Swahili is a lingua franca of East Africa. On the coast, it has long been spoken as a native language. So as Swahili spread inland in Tanzania, it was simplified in structure and even further inland. So in Zaire, it underwent still further simplification. Such simplification was also accompanied by a reduction in the function, that is, the simplified varieties were not used for as many purposes as the fuller variety of the coast. So in rural northern parts of Zaire, even more simplification resulted, so that the Swahili spoken there became virtually unintelligible to coastal residents. And while the existence of this variety demonstrates that Swahili was being used as a lingua franca, what many people were actually using was a pidginized form, Zaire Pidgin Swahili. So in this respect, those who used the variety were not unlike many today who use English as a lingua franca. They use local pidginized versions of English, not standard English. So today, that Zaire Pidgin English has become a Creole, restructured Swahili, and it is considerably different from Swahili of the coast. So even in respect that we would say that because Swahili, form of Swahili was pidginized also, and then English, when it was used as a lingua franca, they also locally pidginized, they used locally pidginized versions of English and not just the standard English. So today the pidgin English has become a Creole, and so they restructured Swahili, and it is considered different from the Swahili that is spoken on the coast. So in North America, Chinook jargon was used extensively as a lingua franca among native peoples of the Northwest. And we would say that in North America, so they took the Chinook jargon and used it extensively as a lingua franca among the native people of the Northwest, from British Columbia into Alaska during the second half of the 19th century. So jargon is one of the original derogatory terms of a pidgin. Speakers of English and French also learned it. So today, Chinook jargon is virtually extinct. Its vocabulary came from various sources, principally Nootka, Chinook, Chehalis, and all Amerindian languages, and French and English. The sound system tended to vary according to the native language of whoever spoke Chinook jargon. So the grammar ostensibly Chinook was extremely reduced, so that it is really quite difficult to say with conviction that it is more Chinook than anything else. So students, that is all for today's lecture, and we will continue to learn about social linguistics in our next lecture. So good day.